I'm about to tell you something that might hurt, but it could save your relationship with your adult children. That protective parenting you thought was love? It might be exactly why they don't return your calls anymore. You sacrificed everything for them. You made sure they were safe, guided every decision, protected them from every mistake. And now they're distant. Cold. They barely visit. You're confused because all you did was care. But here's what nobody told you. Sometimes the problem isn't that you didn't love enough. It's that you loved in a way that suffocated. Let me explain what really happens when protection turns into control. When safety becomes a cage. And most importantly, why your adult children might be pulling away from the very person who gave them everything. First, let's talk about the invisible line between protection and control. When your children were young, making decisions for them was necessary. They needed you to choose their clothes, their food, their bedtime. That's good parenting. But something happens when parents can't turn off that protective instinct as children grow. The guidance becomes interference. The concern becomes criticism. The protection becomes prison. Think about it this way. Every time you made a decision for them, you sent a message. Sometimes that message was love and care. But other times, without meaning to, the message was different. It said you don't trust them. You don't believe they can handle it. You think they'll fail without you. Here's where it gets painful. Your adult children remember every time you doubted them. Every time you stepped in when they wanted to try. Every time you said no when they wanted to explore. Those moments accumulated like drops of water filling a bucket. Eventually, the bucket overflowed. And that overflow looks like distance, resentment, and those unreturned phone calls. Now let's examine the second major issue. Overprotective parents often struggle with boundaries. You might think you're just being helpful when you offer unsolicited advice about their career, their relationship, their parenting choices. But your adult children hear something else entirely. They hear that you still see them as incapable children who need constant guidance. Consider this real scenario. Your daughter mentions she's tired from work. You immediately launch into suggestions about changing jobs, managing stress, reorganizing her schedule. You think you're helping. She thinks you're implying she can't handle her own life. She stops sharing. You wonder why she's distant. The cycle continues. The truth is brutal but necessary. Many adult children don't resent their parents for caring. They resent them for not stopping. For not recognizing that caring looks different when your child is 30 than when they were 3. The same actions that kept them safe as toddlers make them feel incompetent as adults. Here's the third critical point. Overprotective parenting creates what psychologists call learned helplessness. When you constantly rescue your children from challenges, from failures, from consequences, you rob them of something precious. The chance to build confidence through overcoming obstacles. The opportunity to learn that they're capable of handling difficulty. Your adult children might struggle with decision-making now. They might second-guess themselves constantly. They might feel anxious about taking risks. And somewhere deep down, they associate these feelings with you. With the message you unintentionally sent over decades. The message that the world is too dangerous, that they're not strong enough, that they need you to survive. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. And sometimes the only way they know to break free from that burden is to create distance. Physical distance. Emotional distance. The kind of distance that breaks a parent's heart. Let's talk about the fourth issue. Control disguised as concern. This is perhaps the most difficult pattern for parents to recognize in themselves. You genuinely believe you're just worried about their well-being. But your worry manifests as questions that feel like interrogations. Suggestions that sound like demands. Concerns that come across as judgments. When your son tells you about a new business venture, do you immediately list all the ways it could fail? When your daughter shares her parenting approach, do you explain why your method was better? These responses might come from a place of love, but they land as criticism. as lack of faith, as the same old pattern of you knowing better. Your adult children want something different from you now. They want you to trust them, to believe in their ability to navigate life, to celebrate their choices even when those choices are different from what you would have chosen. They want a parent who can step back and watch them fly, even if that flight looks wobbly sometimes. The fifth painful truth is about emotional manipulation. Many overprotective parents use guilt without even realizing it. Phrases like "after everything I've done for you," or "I'm just trying to help," or "I worry because I love you" become weapons. They make adult children feel obligated to accept unwanted advice, to tolerate boundary violations, to prioritize your feelings over their own needs. This creates a toxic dynamic. Your children feel trapped between honoring you and living their own lives, between being grateful and being authentic. That's an impossible position. And often, the only way out they can see is distance. If they can't set boundaries without guilt, they'll set geographical or emotional distance instead. Here's the sixth critical factor. Overprotective parents often struggle with their children's independence because it threatens their own identity. For decades, being a parent was your primary role, your purpose, your identity. When your children needed you less, who were you? That's a terrifying question. So unconsciously, you might have created situations where they still needed you, where you remained essential. But your children could sense this. They could feel that your help came with strings attached, that your involvement wasn't really about them. It was about you maintaining your role, your purpose, your identity. That realization breeds resentment, because they realize they weren't just children to you. They were supporting characters in your story of being needed. The seventh point hits hardest. Your adult children might have tried to tell you. Not directly, because they love you and didn't want to hurt you. But through hints. Through small requests for space. Through gentle pushback. Through choosing not to share certain things. These were attempts at setting boundaries, at teaching you how they needed to be loved now. But if you're like many overprotective parents, you didn't hear those hints. Or you heard them as rejection rather than as requests for a different kind of relationship. You pushed harder instead of pulling back. You increased contact instead of respecting distance. You interpreted their need for independence as a personal attack. So what happens now? How do you bridge this distance if you recognize yourself in these patterns? The answer isn't easy, but it's simple. You have to let go. Not of loving them. Not of being their parent. But of controlling them. Of protecting them from a world they're already living in. Of making their choices for them. You have to apologize. Not with excuses or justifications. Not with, "but I only wanted what's best for you." A real apology acknowledges harm without defending intention. It sounds like, "I'm sorry I didn't respect your boundaries. I'm sorry I made you feel incapable. I'm sorry I let my fear control how I loved you." Then comes the hardest part. Change. Actual behavioral change. When they share something, ask questions instead of giving advice. When they make a choice you disagree with, support them anyway. When you feel the urge to protect, to guide, to control, pause. Breathe. Remember that they survived this long without your constant intervention. Create new patterns of interaction. Ask about their lives without offering solutions. Share your own vulnerabilities instead of always being the strong protector. Respect their no without guilt trips. Celebrate their independence instead of mourning your decreased importance. Understand that rebuilding trust takes time. Your adult children have decades of experience with your overprotective patterns. One conversation won't erase that history. Consistency will. Showing up differently, repeatedly, over months and years. Proving through actions that you've truly changed. Some of you might be thinking this is unfair. That you sacrificed everything and now you're being blamed for loving too much. But here's the truth. Nobody's blaming you for loving. The issue isn't the love. It's how that love was expressed. It's the failure to evolve that love as your children grew. Your intentions were good. Your actions came from fear and care. But impact matters more than intention. And the impact of overprotective parenting is adult children who feel smothered, controlled, and ultimately driven away from the very person who wanted to keep them close. The good news is this: relationships can heal. Distance can close. But only if you're willing to do the uncomfortable work of examining your own behavior, of admitting mistakes, of changing patterns that have been in place for decades, of loving differently than you've ever loved before. Your adult children don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be self-aware. They need you to respect them as adults. They need you to trust that you raised them well enough to handle their own lives. Even when they stumble. Even when they choose differently than you would. Even when they don't need you the way they once did. The relationship you want with your adult children is possible. But it requires you to become a different kind of parent. Not a protector. Not a guide. Not a problem solver. A supporter. A cheerleader. A safe place to land when they need it, but not a hovering presence they can't escape. This transformation isn't easy. It requires grieving the role you once had. Accepting that your children are autonomous adults. Trusting that your job is largely done. But on the other side of that grief and acceptance is something beautiful. A real relationship between adults. Built on mutual respect. Free from resentment. Characterized by choice rather than obligation. So if you're sitting here recognizing yourself in these patterns, don't despair. Recognition is the first step. Understanding why your adult children pulled away gives you the power to change. To reach out differently. To apologize authentically. To build something new. The distance you're experiencing isn't permanent unless you make it so. By refusing to change. By defending your past actions. By continuing the same patterns that created the distance in the first place. But if you're willing to do the hard work, to sit with discomfort, to love in a new way, reconciliation is possible. Your protective parenting came from love. Nobody doubts that. But it's time to protect something different now. Not your children from the world. But your relationship with them from your own fear. That's the protection that matters now. That's the love they need.